Switzerland is the most complete form of it. And so in these political units within Germany and within the United States, probably some others, you have traces of it elsewhere. Like for instance in France, every so many years you have one referendum about the institutions, sometimes about silly things like the presidency used to be for 7 years, then they had a referendum to change it to 5 years. I mean, very unimportant, whereas really important things are not put to referendum. Some things are too important not to consult the people about. That exists in quite a few places. In Holland, for example, they had a very prescient referendum some 10 years ago about whether Ukraine should become a member of the European Union. The idea was that every member state of the European Union should be able to have its say about the accession of a new state. And so, mostly because those who took the initiative for the referendum were very anti-European Union, the vote went against. Now, when you look at what happened with Ukraine afterwards, you see maybe this was a very important topic. At the time I thought, well, what are they talking about? This seemed not to concern anyone. Maybe it was quite prescient, though I don't know if I would have voted against. As far as I'm concerned, you see, of course, the enormous corruption in Ukraine has to be cleaned up. But yeah, I mean, of course they can become members. When Portugal, Spain and Greece, that had been dictatorships, you see, became members of the European Union, they were also pretty far from the European ideal, but they have integrated and it has worked. So, you see, I'm not sure I would be against it, but at any rate, you see, the people who took the initiative for the referendum, they were against it and they won. The first argument for democracy is that it's intelligent in the sense that you get a feedback loop. Those who take the decisions are those who undergo the consequences of the decisions. You see, in a authoritarian system, that's not the case. It's the man at the top who says, okay, we're going to war. But it's the boys in the field who have to, be collected for the army. They get the gun thrown into their hands and then they have to, go shoot. And all that they can get from it is hopefully they come back home alive. That's all. And so it's the generals who get the glory if they win. So it's more intelligent if the people who are really concerned with the outcome also take the decision. So that's the basic argument in favor of democracy. Then here in this case, if you have representative democracy, very soon you will find that the representatives form a new elite and do not really represent the people. For example, in the noughties, 2005 thereabouts, there was a proposal of a European Union constitution. Now, this was very laughable. The Indian constitution is already too long. That was far longer. And some people said this must be put to popular vote. And so several countries organized a referendum, Holland and France. And the parliamentarians in both countries were in majority in favor of this constitution. But you see, in the referendum, it turned out that the popular voter in both countries was in majority against this constitution. So this meant not only that the constitution could not be accepted, which they solved in a very European Union manner, namely, they took the same texts and they gave them another label than constitution, and then they accepted them anyway. But so at least you see that this constitution had been voted out. But the interesting lesson is that the parliamentarians in both countries, and it would have turned out like that in most countries, were of a different opinion than the people they represented. So they weren't representing their voters.
They were doing what they wanted.
Yes, and so against that problem, referendum is the answer. Now, you don't have to always have a referendum. You see, many people are not concerned with what those people in Brussels or in Delhi are deciding. And, you know, their life goes more or less on, you know, regardless of what they decide. But sometimes it's important enough, and then they draw to themselves the right to impose a decision through referendum. And so it's not that, you see, they have to vote on everything. And on many things, they will simply have trust in what the people above us decide. It's only when they choose, this is important for me, here I want to have a say, then they will do it. And so I think that is eminently sensible. Suppose you have, like in Scotland, you had a referendum about independence. Suppose you have the same referendum in Kashmir. And effectively, that is what the separatists are demanding. You see, you know, united plebiscite front and so on. You know, the story behind this, I guess you know, but let's recapitulate. Nehru stopped the advance of the army. The army was busy reconquering the part of Kashmir that had been taken by Pakistan. So he stopped them and he took the issue to the United Nations. And so the United Nations says this has to be decided by referendum. And so Nehru was all in favor of it. But the circumstance at that time was that Nehru was fairly confident of winning the referendum. And so that was not a decision taken on the basis of religion. I see many people now, Pakistanis and so on, are going to say, yeah, it's a majority Muslim country. Of course, they would have voted in favor of accession to Pakistan. That's not true. Because at that time, first of all, Islamic consciousness was not uniformly spread. Even after the partition referendum, which did show a large Muslim majority in favor of Muslim politics, yet you see it's a mixed picture. Like in Afghanistan, for example, when the war between Israel and the Arabs broke out in 1948, you see some tribes asked the king, then there was a king in Afghanistan, for permission to go and fight in West Asia on the side of Israel. Because in Afghanistan there is this belief that some of the tribes' names are the same names as some of the, you know, prophets or so of the Old Testament. So in spite of them being Muslims, they felt a kinship with the Jews. So they agreed to go fight on the side of the Jews. Okay, so, you know, at the time, these religious identities were not so fixed as they are today. Today, they all watch, you know, TV programs or now on the internet and so on. They get constant indoctrination in Islam. You see, back then, this was much more loose. So that's one factor. Then, probably decisive factor is the bad blood between Jinnah and Sheikh Abdullah, the Kashmiri leader. And so Sheikh Abdullah calculated that, you see, if I join India, I don't have this enemy Jinnah to deal with. And moreover, India is going to be a lot more relaxed about Kashmiri autonomy than Pakistan is going to be. They're going to leave us to our devices as long as we don't break away, you know, whereas Pakistan is going to meddle and militarize the area and so on. So he was in favor of India, and him being a very popular leader probably would have taken the masses along with him. And there would have been a majority vote pro-India. At least, you see, that was what Nehru calculated. But it didn't come to that, because one of the conditions for a referendum was that Pakistan withdraw its troops. and that there would only be an Indian police force just enough to keep order, but not to fight wars. And so that Pakistan refused. It kept its army there. And so nothing came of the referendum. Now later, when Sheikh Abdullah turned against Nehru, then of course the people would have voted for Pakistan, even more for independence. But if the choice was between India and Pakistan, they would not vote for India. And so since then, you know, if you would have a referendum, very probably the vote would not be in favor of staying with India. And even now, the atmosphere is a lot better. There's no terrorism, or, well, very little terrorism in Kashmir anymore. Nevertheless, if those people were called to the secrecy of the voting booth, I guess they might still vote against India. So these are risks you take in direct democracy. So within Europe, the situation has been fairly stable. Now, of course, I fear for it, but so far, the last 70 years or so, those things were possible. You could say, okay, give a free hand to the people, you know, let them choose. Nothing dramatic was at stake. Whereas in India, you are dealing with serious things like Kashmiri secession. Maybe you get a revival of Naga separatism, of Tamil separatism, and so on. Because if you take that decision now, you don't know what circumstances are going to develop later on, and they may, you know, pick the fruits of the decision you have now taken. And so, you see, there I agree that what I wrote about direct democracy, I will 100% defend it in the case of Europe. In India, maybe it'll take a few more generations before you can do that. So again, you see, democracy is not always the answer. I think democracy is a good system. As Winston Churchill said, it's a bad system, but it is the best we have. But so sometimes you have to put it between brackets in expectation of its full revival. But so sometimes, you know, it is not always the answer.